Oil is done, kind of. While oil continues to grow, the International Energy Agency predicts that we could hit peak oil demand sometime in the 2030s, possibly as soon as 2028. Now, obviously, we will never be done with oil. There's a whole industry dedicated to turning the black goo into everything, from plastic to the clothes you wear, and from drugs to the fertilizer that feeds you. These are all made with oil and will likely stay that way for decades. But what is also obvious is that the world is trying to distance itself from its oil dependence. The EU and Japan have both pledged to have all new car sales be electric by 2035, and the world's two superpowers, America and China, are both investing hundreds of billions of dollars into national renewable energy projects. Add on top that oil is a technically finite resource, and now there's a strategic reason countries might want to shift away from it. I'm sorry, but it doesn't take a financial analyst to tell you that we're probably going to be using less oil in a couple decades than we do now. This might be good news to you, or to them, but if your name is Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, this new world is what you've been dreading for years. That's because our friend MBS is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and if you know anything about Saudi Arabia, besides the holy cities, deserts, and massive towers they have, it's that the Saudis have a lot of oil. When I say a lot, I mean an unfathomable amount of oil. Saudi Arabia has nearly a fifth of all proven oil reserves, and unlike the country with the most, Venezuela, Saudi oil is both cheap and easily accessible. They have the world's largest onshore field at Ghawar, Safaniya, which is the world's largest offshore field, and Abqaiq, the world's largest oil processing facility. Just Ghawar alone is 280 kilometers long, 100 meters deep, and produces about as much oil a year as Kazakhstan does. And look at the Kazakhstanis' exports. This one field could produce almost 4 million barrels of oil a day until 2050 before it runs out. It can make it cheaply too, at around $4 a barrel to pump up Saudi oil compared to about $40 a barrel to frack for American shale. This makes the country as a whole the second largest producer of oil and, with a relatively small population, easily the world's largest exporter. And the thing is, Saudi Arabia is producing far below its full capacity. As part of the OPEC cartel, Saudi Arabia has actually cut oil production through most of the 2020s in an effort to drive its price up. In 2022, after production cuts and the supply shocks coming from opening up the world and the Ukraine war, record high prices let Saudi Aramco, the state-owned oil company, report an insane $161 billion in profit. Man, Apple didn't even crack 100 bills, which gets to a bigger issue in Saudi Arabia. They are absolutely dependent on oil. 40% of their real GDP, 70% of their exports, and around 75% of average government revenue comes from digging up oil and marketing up its price. Saudi Arabia is a country with no income tax and a very odd division of labor, with a third of their population coming as foreign contract workers and over half of their working citizens working for the government. As a country, they're absolutely dependent on this oil money coming up to the government and it's sprinkling down onto the citizens. They can produce a barrel of oil for around $4 and sell it for around $80. This $76 or so profit is what we call its rent, the oil rent. Saudi Arabia is not a working economy, you could say it's a rentier economy. And so, despite the world planning to reduce their dependence on oil, the country is doing two quite weird things. One is they're actually ramping up their oil and natural gas capacities with large-scale projects to tap, refine, and export previously untouched reserves. And two, despite the high prices of the early 2020s, there is a conscious effort not to spend the insane amount of money they're making. Why are they doing this? It's because the Saudis are preparing to gamble this money on a chance to save themselves. Otherwise, well, they're bound to fade into irrelevance along with their favorite material. Vision 2030. Wow. This is an ambitious, complete, and probably overhyped transformation of nearly everything in Saudi society by the year 2030. It wants to develop a thriving non-oil economy, to be on the cutting edge of technology and have some of the best educational institutes in the world. It promises a vision of sustainability, investing billions into solar, wind, and carbon capture projects to make up for approximately 0.2% of their energy currently coming from renewables to hit their goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. They're investing into desalination plants and agriculture, and you know what? It's surprisingly kind of working. They want to become a regional hub of finance and logistics with new financial tech developments in cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. They're investing into anything science. I'm talking artificial intelligence, literal flying cars, and the Saudi Genome Project. Spending on new housing built all over the country and most importantly in their new green capital of Riyadh. Spending on anything that will drive a new Made in Saudi campaign, a large chunk of what's actually being made in Saudi being petrochemicals. And biggest of all, they're investing into anything that will drive tourists to come to Saudi Arabia. What do you need in the modern age of megacities and the internet for tourists to leave their bubble and to come to you? You need something massive and unique. Like the Jeddah Tower, projected to be the world's tallest building when complete. Trojena, a futuristic city that will act as a ski resort in the middle of the desert. The Mukab, a 400-meter tall cube to host a sustainable mini-city inside of. Qiddiya, a dopamine paradise where you can indulge in anything from a water park to cool off, to racing around this track, to watching any type of sport, to playing games in their esports stadium. And of course, the line. Do I even need to explain this? Saudi Arabia is planning on building a 170-kilometer long linear city. Why? Because they want 100 million annual tourists coming to Saudi Arabia by 2030 to make up at least 10% of their GDP, with 1 million citizens working across these insane projects. And they want to spread out the tourism gains as well. Sure, Saudi Arabia already has a thriving tourist industry, but it's mostly concentrated around Mecca, where every Muslim is encouraged to travel to at least once in their life. But if you think these developments might all be a little too much to handle, I'd say you're probably right. But it surely symbolizes the optimism and the desperation to reduce Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil. MBS himself has said Saudi Arabia has an oil addiction, and a direct goal of the vision is to diversify the economy to hedge against any future oil crashes. Getting off of oil is as much for the security of the nation as it is for economic growth. The only thing is, the bill for this transformation, it isn't cheap. It runs up to the trillions of dollars. Trillions! Over 3 to be specific. For their efforts, Saudi Arabia predicts the vision will create over 500,000 government jobs. But the oil-subsidized government job basically assigned to Saudi citizens at birth is something they're trying to move away from. One of their explicit goals is to create a booming and, importantly, profitable private sector, either through increasing women participation, opening up foreign investment to whoever wants to do business, or what they're most accustomed to, just throwing billions of dollars at the problem. The size of their industrial policy would make Xi Jinping and Joe Biden blush, and it's much more centralized in the hands of one man too. The problem with this method is you don't know which industries are working and which ones aren't. A borderline infinite supply of money being handed to you is enough to make anything seem profitable. And this supply, even if it passes hands multiple times, is ultimately derived from their oil reserves. For example, Lucid, the first ever car manufacturer in Saudi Arabia making what will be luxury electric vehicles, is 60% owned by the National Oil Fund. And across the country, about 80% of non-oil growth in the last 5 years has been driven by government spending, which is basically oil spending. The country is a long way from being financially independent from oil. So part of this drive for the new private industry is to create a healthy tax base, something they're testing with a new tax on all goods and services. But if there are no benchmarks to assess the efficiency of the new ventures, well, I'm not sure there'll be great tax revenue for the royal family. And so the kingdom is in kind of a chicken and egg situation. If they don't explicitly invest into private business, then Saudi workers have no incentive not to just take their oil rent and a comfy government job. But But if they do invest, then they're more dependent on the oil rent than ever, creeping its way into everybody's pockets through their industrial policy. The Crown Prince needs more than just fiscal responsibility to solve this. He needs fiscal wizardry, which is where this gaggle of sheikhs comes in. The Public Investment Fund. It's one of the largest oil funds on earth that could ironically be their ticket out of a rentier economy. It's a diversified portfolio investing in everything from Uber to Nintendo to all of these companies that manages over $700 billion of assets, closing in on $1 trillion. This is one of the main tools MBS is using to push Saudi out of oil, and the way it works is relatively simple. Instead of the government spending the oil money directly, worrying about fluctuating prices and production quotas, they pool a large part of the profits into this account, manage the money a little bit, let it grow, and then spend it in a more responsible way. That way, it's a smooth flow of money coming down to the people instead of spending based on how high the oil price is on that particular day. This is the best way they can spend the oil rent on things with benefits like infrastructure, health systems, and education. And so the Saudi royal family is one of the largest domestic and international investors. Any major tech company, they're in that. Video game companies, yup. Electric vehicles, they've got money in that. Travel, bought it. The PIF financed a brand new airport and airline, and the most flashy industry they've recently gotten into, sports. Billions upon billions of Saudi oil dollars have found their way into international sports. The PIF bought Newcastle United, they owned 4 clubs in the Saudi Pro League, they owned Live Golf, which eventually merged with the PGA to the upset of many, many, many golfers.
I still hate Live.
They signed Ronaldo on a $200 million yearly contract to play for Al Nassr FC. They're hosting the 2027 Asian Cup, the 2034 World Cup, and the 2029 Asian Winter Games. Yes, Winter Games in Saudi Arabia. Crazy. And they've invested heavily into international tennis, boxing, cricket, MMA, motorsports, and horse racing. Why are they doing this? Top-down approaches generally don't work in sports. You can't force an audience to like a certain sport, especially if there's no folk culture of them playing it. 3 simple reasons. They want eyes on Saudi Arabia, they want to delegate more to private business, like hoping the PGA will manage much of their golf scene for them, and, of course, money.
Well, if sport washing gonna increase my GDP by 1%, and then I will continue doing sport washing.
You're okay with that term?
I don't care. I have 1% growth of GDP from sport, and I'm aiming for another 1.5%. Call it whatever you want. We're going to get that 1.5%.
Something similar goes for these insane giga projects they're planning. They need to be financed using the Public Investment Fund, or there would be no chance they could be built. The line alone is expected to cost up to $500 billion, and let's be honest, that's just a guess this soon into the construction process. They're spending on all these in an effort to attract tens of millions of tourists into Saudi Arabia, who they hope will spend tens of billions of dollars. Will one of the largest government-led construction splurges the world has ever seen be enough to escape their oil rent dependence? Well, who knows? A couple decades' time will tell us. But what's even the point? What is building a massive cube or buying Ronaldo gonna do? Doesn't that seem kind of odd for a mass-scale economic development project? Well, one reason is branding. Brand equity matters as much for countries as it does for companies, and right now, well, Saudi Arabia does not have the best record in the world. Even if you skip past the human rights abuses, I'd bet most people think of Saudi Arabia as that place that sells oil to us, not the place we're dying to visit. If branding didn't matter in countries, then why are there, say, millions of people who have never been to Canada that would immediately move there if they got the chance? It's because Canada has developed a brand of being a relatively safe, open, and wealthy country. It doesn't matter if you think that's true or not, that's the brand they sell the world, and it works. If Saudi can really sell the brand of being the new pinnacle of luxury and innovation, that could absolutely affect their ability to do business with and attract foreigners, putting the Saudi name into the mind of everyone. Another reason, Their social contract is breaking. As a rentier economy, most Saudi citizens have either been directly paid by the oil runs or benefited from the development, subsidies, and social allowances oil brings. And in return for the rent, the royal family was given absolute control over politics, social habits, and most of the economy. But now that the government has explicitly said they want to distance themselves from oil, what happens to this social contract? Well, they're just making a new one, either from literal rents paid to the government by, say, massive sports enterprises, which would eventually make its way down to the people in the same way oil rents do, or by the brand name and coolness of the new developments. Most Saudis are quite young. 2/3 of citizens are younger than 35. This push to become a global sports, luxury tourism, or video game hub is pretty clearly aimed at a younger audience looking for the best experiences in life. If they can find them without leaving their own country, all the better. All while the government eases on some of the more controlling laws they had imposed. Women can now drive, which has only been legal since 2018. Movie theaters are now open to the people. Music can be played out loud in public, and alcohol can now be sold to non-Muslim diplomats. So instead of the implicit contract being a trade between obedience and oil money, it will now be traded for ski resorts, the World Cup, and anything fun. To be honest, I think the second one is a little bit cooler. And the biggest problem moving on from a rentier economy is trying to solve, or potentially make worse, is exactly that, the rentiers. I'm talking about the Saudi citizens who find an easy job in the public sector and live out easy days with their new wealth. The average Saudi makes about as much as the average Canadian, but is less educated than the average Gabonese. That sounds like a great job to me, but for the nation as a whole, it's unsustainable. 95% of workers in the public sector are Saudi citizens, but citizens only make up around 17% of private sector workers, with the rest of them being foreign contract workers. That's why the demographics of Saudi Arabia are so heavily tilted towards men. This bulge makes up the bulk of the country's workers, and so the push to make a new Saudi Arabia isn't just a push for brand name, it's to get their citizens working in highly skilled fields. After all, economic development is usually just the development of skills across a large population. But if they can actually develop skills by throwing endless money at some industries and praying they make something innovative, that's to be determined. When East Asia was developing, many countries used exports as a benchmark to tell which manufacturers were working and which ones weren't. Saudi Arabia probably needs some sort of measure to determine how well Saudi AI, Saudi EVs, or let's be honest, Saudi petrochemicals will do without government aid. Their government to private consumption is already around 3 times the world average, and with their current employment structure, it would be very hard to start taxing private citizens as the main form of state revenue. So to become post-rentier by 2030, or sometime after 2030 more likely, it will involve sacrifices made by the citizens, something the kingdom does not want, remembering the wave of revolts that spread across the Arab states in the early 2010s, ousting 4 governments in the process. If Saudi Arabia can become a highly skilled country with a high productivity, this program will absolutely pay off. It may be one of the first economies to escape the petrostate curse if it can pull it off. Otherwise, well, opening up society and building massive projects are cool, but economies are made by people, not by buildings. If the people don't benefit in some way, then it might be a sign they should have invested in more traditional sectors. We'll just have to see if this particular gamble will make its way down to the people. And before you go, don't forget to check out War Thunder. If you're new or haven't played for 6 months, play now for free and you'll get a massive bonus pack with multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more. Thanks.